Hey there. Tonight, we're going somewhere that history mostly forgot, the kind of place you'd never find on a map anymore. So, get comfortable, slow your breathing a little, and imagine a hill surrounded by fog. There's a castle on top of it, of course, because every strange story begins that way. But this one isn't about a haunted castle or a cursed one. It's about a place that simply decided one day to stop letting people go. The castle didn't have a famous name. It wasn't one of those golden palaces that make it into tourist guides. It was just a gray mass of stone perched above a quiet valley in what used to be southern France. The year, roughly, was 1786, a few years before everything in that country decided to catch fire. Back then, though, this hill still belonged to a man named Lord Etienne d'Aubercourt, a name you've never heard, and probably never should have. Etienne was not the sort of nobleman who threw parties or loved people. He was the kind who loved rules, and his castle was his favorite rule of all. He inherited it young, when the world was changing faster than he could tolerate. Peasants were reading pamphlets, merchants were getting richer than lords, and priests were quietly drinking more wine than they blessed. Etienne didn't like change, so he did what all frightened men of his kind did. He built walls, both literal and otherwise. The castle had 57 rooms, 12 servants, and one endless corridor that seemed to lead nowhere. It was the kind of place that sighed at night, a living structure made from too many generations of pride. The walls were damp, the torches burned unevenly, and the air always smelled faintly of stone and lavender. The villagers who lived below the hill said that time didn't work properly up there. They said the sun set slower behind the castle, and that you could hear the bells toll long after they'd stopped ringing. But then again, villagers said things about every castle, didn't they? What made this one different was the rule. Etienne's rule. No one, under any circumstance, was to leave the castle once they entered. Not guests, not servants, not family. Once you crossed the gate, you were part of it. Forever. At first, it sounded like eccentric noble nonsense. Most of his household assumed it was symbolic, a way of saying loyalty above all. But then, one evening, a servant named Leo tried to leave. He'd only been there for 3 weeks. He'd grown up in the valley, and had been told the pay was good, and it was for a while. But after sunset, when he went to the gatehouse, the guards simply didn't open it. "Orders of the Lord," they said, in that practiced tone that always sounds both polite and threatening. He laughed, because surely it was a misunderstanding. He waited until morning. But the next day the order was the same, and the day after that. And soon he realized that no one even questioned it. The other servants moved around him with gentle smiles, as if to say, "This is just how things are." No one looked frightened. No one even looked bored. That, perhaps, was the strangest part. By the second week, he stopped asking. Visitors came sometimes. Merchants bringing wine, cloth, or letters from other estates. But they always left their carts at the gate and passed through alone. The guards would escort them in, and hours later, they'd be sitting at the long table in the dining hall with the others. They didn't go home. Their horses were led away, and their faces, after a few days, began to soften. Not with comfort, but with surrender. The castle absorbed people quietly, not through violence, through patience. Lord Etienne never explained it outright. He didn't have to. He simply existed with a calm certainty that made refusal impossible. He was a thin man, tall, always dressed in heavy black velvet that made him look half-shadow. His face had that particular stillness of aristocrats who've never been contradicted. He wasn't cruel. He was worse than that. He was convinced he was right. He said things like, "Freedom only makes people restless, and order is the highest kindness." The kind of sentences that sound profound if you say them slowly enough. The castle ran smoothly under him. Meals were served at exact times. Candles replaced at dawn. prayers whispered on cue. Even laughter was quiet, polite, never prolonged. If anyone wept, they did it silently. After a while, people stopped noticing the gates at all. They stopped remembering the idea of leaving. In the village below, life went on. Children grew up and grew old, and when they looked up at the castle, they could still see its pale outline through the fog. Sometimes, if the wind was right, they could hear faint music, harps maybe drifting down. Nobody in the valley ever saw anyone come out. But they assumed someone did because deliveries continued, letters came and went, and fires burned in the towers at night. The illusion of movement kept everyone comfortable. Inside, though, something else was happening. The castle was becoming a world in itself. Seasons passed, but they no longer mattered. People inside grew older, but slower. Time stretched the way it does in places where repetition replaces purpose. Conversations looped, faces blurred. New arrivals learned the rhythm within days: eat, work, sleep, pretend. By the 5th year of the rule, no one could remember who had been there longest. The outside world became myth. Someone once asked if the king still ruled France, and no one knew the answer. Etienne had stopped hosting messengers by then. He preferred the silence. He called it peace. Of course, peace has a cost. It always does. And one morning, when the fog hung heavier than usual, the castle cook, an old woman named Martine, set down her knife, stared at her own reflection in the silver tray, and quietly said, "I think I've already died." No one corrected her. She wasn't entirely wrong. The people in that castle had stopped living in any way that counted. They still breathed, they still worked, they still smiled politely, but all of it felt like rehearsal for a life they'd forgotten. And yet, oddly enough, none of them seemed to hate Etienne for it. That might be the most unsettling part of all. They adored him. They called him father, and thanked him for keeping them safe from the world. He accepted their gratitude with calm indifference, the way a priest accepts prayer. If you visited the castle then, you might not notice anything wrong. You'd see a tidy household, quiet hallways, the faint smell of baking bread. But you'd feel it, that absence of motion, that thick, invisible weight pressing down on every moment. The stillness that isn't peace, but something colder. And somewhere deep in the castle, in a sealed chamber that no servant was allowed to clean, Etienne kept a collection of clocks. Dozens of them, none of them ticking. He said he preferred silence. If you've ever stood in a room where every clock has stopped, you'll know what silence really feels like. It isn't the absence of sound. It's a presence of stillness. Something that fills the air, heavy and constant, pressing on the chest until you start to believe that even your heartbeat is too loud. That was how it felt in Lord Etienne's collection room. He called it the Chamber of Hours, which is the sort of name that sounds philosophical until you realize it's just eerie. The room itself sat at the highest point of the castle's east tower, accessible only by a narrow staircase that spiraled upward like a spine. Few people were ever invited there, and fewer still returned unchanged. Inside, the walls were lined with clocks of every kind. French, Swiss, German, some so old they looked carved rather than built. Grandfather clocks with faces like moons. Small travel clocks in brass cases that gleamed like coins. A few pocket watches suspended on hooks, each one open, their glass covers removed, their hands frozen in mid-tick. They had all once worked. You could tell by the thin layer of dust that had settled over the keyholes and gears. The way time itself seemed to have exhaled and stopped. Etienne claimed he could hear them, even when they were silent. He said the air inside that tower carried a hum, a faint reminder that everything in life used to move. Servants sometimes whispered that he wound them at night when no one was looking. Others said he just liked to watch them not move. Whichever was true, the clocks became the heart of the castle's stillness, a shrine to suspended time. No one knew exactly why he kept them, but most assumed it had something to do with the rule. that strange, unspoken law that no one could leave once they entered. Maybe the clocks were his way of keeping score. Maybe they marked how long the castle had been asleep. Or maybe they were just another part of his strange, quiet obsession with control. Because that's what this place really was, a monument to control. By 1788, the rest of France was already trembling. Pamphlets shouted about liberty, taxes, and kings who couldn't hear the hunger below their windows. In the towns not far from the valley, people were whispering about rights and revolutions. But in the castle, the air stayed the same, calm, measured, unmoving. Letters from the outside world arrived less often, and eventually not at all. Etienne told everyone it was by design, that the world was in chaos and they were lucky to be sealed away from it. He smiled when he said it, the way a father might smile while hiding a knife behind his back. To the servants, that seemed reasonable, safe even. To live in a world where nothing changed meant never being surprised, never being hurt. Their days blurred together like pages printed with the same line over and over. And when life becomes repetition, it starts to feel eternal. Some said that when Etienne grew tired of someone, he sent them up there to help him tend to the hours, and that afterward, the clocks sounded slightly different when the wind blew. But no one ever asked. You learn not to in places where curiosity feels dangerous. One evening, as Clara was preparing the dining hall, she found Etienne already seated at the head of the table. The candles hadn't yet been lit. The only light came from the dusk creeping through the tall windows, gray and soft, the kind that turns faces into portraits. He gestured for her to sit. She hesitated because no servant ever sat at the table. "Do you know why I built this house?" he asked without looking at her. She didn't answer. He smiled faintly. "Because the world forgets itself. It eats, it works, it revolts. I wanted to see what happens when you remove that hunger." Clara looked down at her hands, unsure whether she was being tested. "Do you feel trapped here?" he asked. She hesitated. The air between them was heavy. "No, my lord," she lied. He leaned back, satisfied. "Good. You'll see in time. Peace is only frightening until you understand it." After that, he dismissed her. But from that night onward, she couldn't shake the thought that peace, in this place, looked an awful lot like surrender. Weeks passed. The fog outside thickened. The sun seemed slower to rise. And one morning, when she walked past the Chamber of Hours, she heard a sound she'd never heard before, the faint click of a clock hand moving. She froze, listening. Clicked again, sharp and deliberate, like a pulse restarting. When she told the others, they smiled politely and said she must have been mistaken. "The clocks never move," said the butler, his voice calm as stone. "They stopped long ago, and so did we." But that night, when the candles burned low and the castle seemed half asleep, Clara swore she heard it again. The sound of time remembering itself. And somewhere above her, Lord Etienne smiled. The first thing Clara noticed wasn't the clock. It was the sound of breathing. Not hers, not anyone's in the hallway. It was softer, slower, the kind of breathing that doesn't belong to a body you can see. She heard it late one evening, while walking the narrow corridor between the servants' quarters and the main hall. The walls there were close enough to touch on both sides, and the air carried the constant faint hum of the castle itself. Wind through stone, whispers that weren't quite words. She stopped walking and the sound stopped too. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. But then, from behind the wall, or perhaps beneath it, came the long, drawn-out sigh of something that had been waiting a long time to exhale. It was enough to raise the hair on her neck. Clara told herself that it was probably just the draft from the East Tower. But she didn't go back that way again. The days blurred after that. The castle had a way of stretching them out, turning hours into loops. You'd polish a staircase and find dust on it again by evening. You'd light a candle, and it would never seem to burn down. The cook said it was a blessing, less work that way. But to Clara, it felt wrong. Like time itself had forgotten how to finish what it started. The other servants didn't share her unease. They smiled the way people smile when they've forgotten what real emotion feels like. Polite, distant, perfectly shaped. They moved with precision, spoke softly, and went to bed without question. She tried once to talk to Martine, the old cook, about the clocks. "Do you ever hear them move?" she asked. Martine's hands froze over the bread dough. Then she looked up slowly and said, "The clocks are not for telling time. They are for keeping it still." And then she went back to kneading. It was a strange answer, but it was the first honest thing Clara had heard since arriving. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her small room faced the inner courtyard, a square of stone surrounded by walls too tall for moonlight to reach. Normally, it was completely dark, but tonight, she saw a faint glow moving across the courtyard, as if someone was carrying a lantern. She pressed her face to the window and squinted. It wasn't a lantern. It was a figure, tall, dressed in a long coat, walking slowly in a circle. The light didn't come from his hand, but from the object he carried. A small golden watch, glowing faintly from within. Lord Etienne. He was speaking to himself again, though she couldn't hear the words. He stopped, looked up toward her window or maybe through it, and for a moment it felt like his eyes met hers. Calm, unreadable, almost kind. Then the light dimmed, and he vanished into the mist. The next morning, everything in the castle felt heavier. The servants moved slower, like marionettes waiting for a string to be pulled. Breakfast was late, an unheard of thing in Etienne's household. The bread was undercooked, the butter missing. No one seemed to care. When Clara went to the dining hall, the long table was half empty. The butler, a tall man named Gerard, told her quietly that several servants were resting on Etienne's orders. No one asked where. She didn't see Martine again after that day. The silence in the castle began to change. It wasn't peace anymore. It was tension. The air carried weight, like an unspoken argument that everyone was too afraid to have. When you looked at someone too long, they averted their eyes. When you mentioned the outside world, they smiled too quickly and changed the subject. And the clocks, those damned clocks, began to hum. Not loudly, not enough to call it sound. But Clara could feel it when she walked past the East Tower. A vibration through the floorboards, like the faint beat of a pulse somewhere deep in the stone. One evening, as she passed the tower door, she heard Etienne's voice from inside. "You see," he was saying softly, "they're calmer now. They've accepted it." A pause. Another voice answered. Clara froze. It was faint, dry, like air forced through old wood. "They don't accept it," it said. "They've forgotten they can choose." She didn't recognize the voice, but she didn't wait to hear more. She ran down the corridor, heart hammering. When she told the other servants, they gave her the same patient smile. "There's no one else in that tower," Gerard said. "The Lord prefers solitude." But later that night, she lay awake and thought about that second voice. The way it sounded, cracked and quiet, but certain, like someone who remembered what the world used to feel like. After that, Clara started noticing things that didn't fit. A painting in the corridor that changed slightly every few days, the figures inside it shifting, eyes turning in new directions. A vase of flowers that never wilted, though no one replaced them. The fog outside that seemed thicker every morning, until it was hard to tell whether the sun had risen at all. It wasn't madness. It was something older, something built into the stones themselves. The castle wasn't just keeping them in, it was keeping the world out, preserving itself like an insect trapped in amber. And Etienne, he was its caretaker. But even caretakers grow tired. A week later, Clara saw him again, sitting in the courtyard where the fog gathered the thickest. His black coat blended into the mist. He held a single clock in his lap, its face cracked, its hands trembling faintly back and forth, as if trying to remember which direction time was supposed to move. When he noticed her watching, he didn't seem surprised. He simply said, "Do you hear it, child? The sound of the world slowing?" Clara shook her head. He smiled, that same thin, unreadable smile. "Good. You will soon enough." Then he lifted the clock, turned its face toward her, and whispered something she couldn't hear. The fog seemed to pulse, breathing in time with his words. By the time she blinked, he was gone again. That night, all the candles in the castle burned lower than they should have. And the next morning, 3 more servants were resting. The rest went about their duties in perfect silence, pretending not to notice the empty chairs at breakfast. Only Clara looked at the spaces where they had sat, and thought she could still hear the faint ticking beneath her feet. It wasn't peace. It was counting. And whatever it was counting toward, it was getting closer. The castle was full of doors, but only one ever felt like a question. It was narrow and tall, tucked between 2 stretches of the southern corridor, where the light never seemed to reach. No one ever used it, and it was never locked. Yet everyone avoided it. Clara noticed it first on a Tuesday morning. Not that days meant much anymore. She had been carrying folded linens from the washing room when the hem of her dress brushed the wood and sent a small cloud of dust into the air. The door was strange. Old, even by the castle's standards, its iron hinges eaten through by rust. The wood was carved with what looked like vines or veins, curling upward toward the lintel in a pattern that made no sense. She asked Gerard about it that evening. The butler didn't even look up from his ledger. "There is no door there," he said quietly, as if correcting a child who had mispronounced a word. "But," he closed the book sharply, "there is no door there." And that was the end of the conversation. But curiosity, once woken, refuses to go back to sleep. That night, Clara returned with a candle. The hallway was colder than usual, the air still and dry, like the breath had been drawn out of it. The flame flickered as she approached. The door was still there, and as she stood before it, she realized why no one talked about it. It wasn't that they didn't see it. It was that they couldn't. The mind slid around it, as if it were something the eyes were not meant to hold. The candlelight didn't fall evenly on its surface. It bent slightly, as though the air itself were thicker near it. She touched the handle, smooth, cold metal, like the inside of a bell. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a faint sound. A sigh, low and deep, from behind the wood. It wasn't human. It wasn't even exactly sound, more like pressure. The sense of something vast turning in its sleep. Clara stepped back, heart thudding. The candlelight fluttered. And then, just as quickly, everything stilled. The air softened. The castle returned to its steady, patient quiet. She blew out the candle and walked away. But the next morning, the door was gone. Not hidden. Gone. The wall where it had been was smooth stone, the same color as the rest of the corridor. No trace of hinges. No seam. No dust. It was as though she had dreamed it. And maybe she would have believed that, except for one thing. The candle she had left on the floor was still there, and its flame was still burning. No wax, no smoke, just a perfect, steady flame floating in place, impossibly alive. She didn't tell anyone. You learn quickly, in that castle, that questions are more dangerous than secrets. That same evening, Lord Etienne announced dinner would be held earlier than usual. He was in a good mood, which was rare enough to be unsettling. The dining hall gleamed with candlelight. The servants lined the walls like statues, hands folded neatly. The air smelled faintly of lavender and iron. Etienne raised his glass. "My friends," he said, "we have done it. The world below has collapsed into chaos, but we, here, remain. Do you understand what that means? We have preserved civilization. No one spoke, of course. No one ever did when he asked a question that wasn't really a question. He smiled, thin and satisfied. You should be proud. Each of you is part of a perfect moment. One that will never pass. He drank, and the hall murmured its polite echo. Clara looked at the faces around her. They were blankly serene, the same as always. But when her eyes met Gerard's across the room, she saw something flicker, a flash of fear. It was gone almost instantly, but it was enough to tell her she wasn't the only one who felt the wrongness pressing in. Later, when the meal ended, Etienne beckoned Gerard forward. The butler bowed low. "Bring her to me," Etienne said quietly. "Who, my lord?" "You know who." Clara didn't sleep that night. She didn't need to. In the castle, sleep came rarely, and when it did, it was dreamless, a kind of shallow suspension. But her mind raced with the sound of his voice, the memory of that impossible candle. By morning, Gerard knocked softly at her door. "Lord Etienne wishes to see you." Her stomach tightened. The study was dim when she entered, curtains drawn, air thick with incense. Etienne sat at his desk, fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded. On the table before him lay one of his clocks, a small brass one, its face cracked. "Do you know why people fear silence, Clara?" he asked. She shook her head. "Because it listens," he said. "Noise is what we make to prove we exist. But silence remembers what we've forgotten." He turned the clock so that she could see its face. The hands were missing. The glass shimmered faintly, like a thin layer of water. "Do you know what this is?" She didn't answer. "It's a measure of stillness," he said softly. "Every soul here contributes to it. The longer we stay, the quieter the world becomes. The world needs that quiet. It's too loud out there." He stood then, moving toward the window. Outside, the fog pulsed like breath. "They are burning cities now, Clara, eating each other in the name of liberty. You should thank me. Here, no one dies." He looked at her, truly looked. His eyes were pale gray, almost translucent. "You don't believe me yet, but you will. All of you do eventually." She wanted to ask him about the door, about Martine, about the humming clocks, but the words wouldn't come. Something about the way he spoke, calm and deliberate, drained language from the air. When she finally left the room, the candle in the hallway had gone out. The wax was still gone, but there, burned faintly into the floor, was the outline of a door. That night, she dreamed of the same pattern she had seen carved into the wood, those curling vines or veins. Except now, they were spreading through the castle walls like roots, and at the center of them all was Etienne, still and smiling, a clock face where his heart should be. When she woke, she wasn't sure whether it had been a dream at all, and from somewhere deep within the East Tower, a clock struck once, a single note, just enough to remind her that time, however quiet, had not finished yet. Morning in the castle wasn't like morning anywhere else. The light that seeped through the windows wasn't sunlight exactly. It was more like the memory of it, faint and pale, filtered through the fog that never lifted. It turned everything silver. The walls, the furniture, even the people. Clara had stopped trying to count the days. The clocks had made sure of that. But she knew something had shifted. The air no longer hummed with peace. It trembled, as if the castle, that great stone machine of quiet obedience, had begun to strain under its own stillness. She noticed it first in the eyes of the others. The servants no longer smiled quite as evenly. The doctor, the one who was supposed to look after Lord Etienne's health, had started muttering during meals. He would stare down into his cup as though the wine might offer an escape route. "We don't digest anymore," he said one night softly. "We only absorb." Nobody answered. Nobody wanted to. Clara found Gerard in the corridor later that same evening. He was standing by the wall, hands folded, eyes closed, as though praying. But when she came closer, she saw that his lips were barely moving. "You hear it too, don't you?" she asked. He opened his eyes slowly. "I don't know what I hear anymore. Sometimes it's the wind. Sometimes it's them. The clocks." He looked at her with the weariness of someone who had been waiting too long to be believed. "They were never clocks," he said. "They're records. Each one of us is inside one." Clara stared at him. "That's impossible." He gave a tired half-smile. "Everything here is impossible. That's why it works." She didn't know what to say, but the thought dug into her mind like a seed. Later that night, she found herself walking toward the East Tower again. She didn't plan it. It was as if her body had made the decision without her. The air grew colder the closer she got, the silence thicker. At the base of the tower, the great wooden door stood open for the first time. Inside, the darkness seemed alive. She hesitated at the threshold, then stepped in. The Chamber of Hours was smaller than she imagined, and yet somehow endless. Clocks lined every surface, walls, tables, even the floor. Hundreds of them, all silent, their hands frozen at different points, as though each had chosen its own moment to stop living. But what chilled her most was not the clocks. It was the faces reflected in their glass. She saw Martine, the old cook, her reflection faint but unmistakable, eyes closed as if asleep. She saw the merchant who'd arrived last winter, the one who never left. She saw faces she knew and faces she didn't. Every reflection was still, trapped mid-breath, suspended in that strange polished surface. And then she saw herself, not as she was, but as she would be, older, thinner, her eyes hollowed out by years of silence. A soft voice spoke behind her. "Beautiful, aren't they?" She turned. Etienne stood there, candle in hand. The light flickered on the brass and glass, making the frozen faces shimmer like living things. "They're memories," he said gently. "Each clock holds the last moment before someone accepted peace. Once you let go of fear, you stop moving. You see, my dear, eternity isn't fire or punishment. It's rest." Clara stepped back, shaking her head. "This isn't rest. This is death." He smiled faintly. "Death is disorder. This," he gestured around the room, "is perfection. You trapped them," she said. "You trapped everyone here." "No," he said calmly. "They freed themselves. I only showed them how." Something inside her snapped at that. "And me?" she asked. "Did I choose this too?" He looked at her with what might almost have been pity. "You will, in time." Then he turned, as if the conversation had ended, and walked toward the center of the room where a large clock stood against the far wall. Unlike the others, this one still moved. The pendulum swung slowly, left to right, steady and deliberate. "You see this one?" he said softly. "This is mine. I keep it running to remind myself that I am still awake." Clara's eyes followed the pendulum. It was mesmerizing, the way it moved so smoothly, as if it wasn't powered by gears but by breath. She whispered, "What happens when it stops?" Etienne's expression didn't change. "Then the world outside will stop with it." The words fell like stones. Clara didn't wait for him to dismiss her. She turned and fled. The corridors felt wrong on her way back. Longer, darker. The portraits on the walls seemed to turn as she passed. She heard the faint sound of ticking again, but it wasn't coming from the tower anymore. It was everywhere. In the floors, in the air, in her own pulse. By the time she reached her room, she could barely breathe. The candle she'd left on her windowsill had burned down to nothing. She fell onto her bed, shaking. And then, just before sleep took her, she heard Martine's voice. Clear, close, impossible. "You can still wake up, child," it said. "But you must find the first door." When she opened her eyes, it was dawn. The fog outside was thicker than ever, the valley below completely gone. And on the wall opposite her bed, someone had drawn the same curling pattern she'd seen on the vanished door. The twisting lines that looked like vines or veins. Only this time they were growing. Clara didn't move for a long time. She just sat on her bed, staring at the wall. The pattern was faint, drawn not with ink or chalk, but with something that looked like shadow. It shimmered slightly, as though the wall itself was breathing. The longer she looked at it, the more alive it seemed. The vines twisted almost imperceptibly, curling inward toward a point that wasn't there yet. She could hear the castle breathing too. That same faint rhythm she'd noticed before, the pulse of something alive beneath the stone. Only now it was faster. The silence was no longer steady. It throbbed. She stood up slowly and touched the wall. The pattern was cool beneath her fingers, the surface strangely soft, like fabric stretched over bone. When she pressed harder, the vines shifted. The wall rippled. For a heartbeat, she thought it might open. But then the movement stopped, and the stone was solid again. She pulled her hand back and whispered, "The first door." Martine's voice echoed faintly in her mind. "You can still wake up, child, but you must find the first door." She didn't know what it meant, but she knew where to start looking. There had always been a sense that the castle had a beginning, a core that everything else had grown around. The servants spoke of it in half-remembered phrases. The original foundation, the heart of the hill, a place older than Etienne, older than France, maybe older than time itself. If such a place existed, it would be hidden. And no one hid things better than Lord Etienne. She spent the next few days watching him. He had fallen into a routine even stricter than before. At dawn, he would walk the corridors, touching the walls lightly with his fingertips, as though counting something invisible. At noon, he would visit the Chamber of Hours and sit in silence for exactly 1 hour, eyes closed, lips moving faintly. And at dusk, he would climb the North Tower alone, carrying a single candle. No one knew what he did up there, but when he returned, his expression was softer, almost human. Clara waited until the 4th night before following him. The staircase to the North Tower was narrow and spiraled, the stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. She climbed carefully, keeping to the edge, her candle held low to hide its light. Etienne's footsteps were slow but steady above her. Halfway up, she heard him stop. She froze, holding her breath. He spoke softly, not turning around. "You shouldn't be here, Clara." Her heart lurched. "How did you?" "I hear everything in my house," he said calmly. "Even thoughts that haven't yet been spoken." He turned then, his face lit only by the flicker of his candle. "But you're curious. I understand that. Curiosity is the last sign of life. You should treasure it." He descended 2 steps, and she instinctively backed away. "Do you want to see what I see?" he asked. "I want to understand." He smiled faintly. "Understanding is dangerous, but very well. Follow me." He turned and continued up. At the top of the tower was a small circular room, the walls lined with mirrors instead of clocks. Each mirror was old, the glass slightly warped. The reflections were strange. Not wrong exactly, but different. The light bent oddly, as if every mirror showed the room a second behind reality. Etienne stood in the center, holding his candle high. "This," he said softly, "is the first door." Clara frowned. "It's just mirrors." "Everything begins with reflection," he said. The world is a hall of mirrors. People look outward and forget they are only seeing themselves. She stepped closer. The air in the room was heavy, the kind that hums in your teeth. Her reflection stared back, pale, wide-eyed, frightened. Behind her, Etienne's reflection smiled. "Why did you build this place?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved from mirror to mirror, as though checking that they were all still there. Finally, he said, "Because I was afraid. The world was changing too fast. Empires falling, kings trembling, the very rhythm of life speeding up. I wanted to slow it down, to stop it before it broke completely." "And the people here?" she asked. "They volunteered," he said. "Not at first, but eventually they understood. The outside world devours the living. Here, they are preserved." Clara shook her head. "You stole their time. I saved them from it," he said simply. She turned toward the mirrors again. Her reflection seemed to move a heartbeat too late. She reached out a hand. The glass rippled like water. Etienne's voice was almost tender. "Careful. Once you see what's behind it, you cannot unsee." The ripple spread outward, and for an instant she saw something through the glass. A corridor lined with doors, stretching infinitely, each door identical to the next. Behind one of them, she heard the sound of weeping. Behind another, laughter. Behind all of them, ticking. She pulled her hand back sharply. The mirror went still. "What is that?" she whispered. "The foundation," Etienne said. "Every soul who has ever lived here. Every thought that tried to escape. The castle remembers them all." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "But it needs caretakers. People to keep it breathing. That's where you come in." Clara felt her stomach twist. "No," he smiled, patient and certain. "You will, in time. The silence always wins." Before she could answer, the candle flickered, and for a heartbeat, the entire tower went dark. The mirrors flashed white, and in them she saw faces. Dozens of them. Servants, guests, children. Their mouths moved soundlessly. Their hands pressed against the glass. When the light returned, they were gone. Etienne sighed softly. "They're restless lately," he said. "The balance is shifting. I can feel it." He turned toward her again, his tone almost gentle. "If you wish to leave, Clara, you may try. But remember, once you step outside the reflection, you cease to exist here. You'll fade like smoke." She didn't answer. When she left the tower, the air in the corridors felt different. The castle was breathing faster now. The humming of the clocks echoed faintly in the walls. That night, when she lay down, she dreamed of mirrors cracking one by one, and behind each fracture, a light trying desperately to get out. When she woke, her window was covered in frost, and etched into the ice were 5 words she hadn't written. "Find the door beneath time." By morning, the frost on the window had melted, but the words were still there. Not written, not etched, more like pressed into the glass itself, faint and shimmering, as if someone had whispered them onto the surface and the whisper had decided to stay. Find the door beneath time. The castle had no maps, at least none that showed what lay below. The servants only spoke of the main halls, the kitchens, the towers. No one mentioned the foundation or the crypts or whatever lay under the stones. And yet everyone walked a little faster past the staircases that descended instead of climbed. Clara had always thought the silence of the castle was thickest in the East Tower. She was wrong. It was deeper below. Down there, silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the sound itself. The way the world sounded before the first heartbeat. She began her search quietly, the way a thought begins, uncertain of its own purpose. She went first to the kitchens. where the air was warmer and the smell of bread almost masked the rot that lived behind the walls. Martine's absence was still felt there, like a missing chord in a familiar song. The new cook, a quiet girl named Eloise, barely looked up when Clara asked about cellars or storerooms. "There's nothing below," Eloise said softly, kneading dough with movements too smooth to be human. "The castle stands on its own shadow." Clara didn't press. You couldn't press anyone here. Their minds slid away from questions like oil on glass. That night, she tried again, this time in the library. It was a vast, echoing room filled with books no one ever read. Dust coated everything in a uniform gray. The shelves stretched higher than sight, and the upper levels disappeared into darkness. She wasn't sure what she was looking for until she found it. A small, leather-bound volume on the lowest shelf, spine cracked, its title erased by time. She opened it carefully. The pages smelled of smoke. Inside, there were no words, only drawings. Circles, lines, and strange symbols that looked like the veins on the vanished door. At the bottom of the last page was a phrase written in faded ink. "What is above was built to hide what is below." Clara stared at it for a long time. That night, she dreamed again of the mirrors. But this time, one of them cracked. Not from outside, but from within. Something behind the glass was pushing. When she woke, the castle was shaking. It wasn't an earthquake. It was subtler than that, a vibration through the air, through the bones, like the hum of a great machine that had just been restarted. The clocks were moving again, slowly, hesitantly, as if unsure whether they were supposed to. The servants didn't react. They continued their routines with eerie calm. Plates clinked, footsteps echoed, but Clara could see it in their eyes now, a faint flicker of awareness returning. And in Etienne's eyes, for the first time, a trace of fear. He appeared at breakfast, which was unusual. He normally avoided daylight. He looked older somehow, his posture slightly bent, his voice sharper. "The air is changing," he said quietly, not to anyone in particular. "The balance is thinning." No one responded. Then he looked directly at Clara. "If you've been dreaming, I suggest you stop." She lowered her gaze. "Dreams can't be stopped." He smiled faintly. "Everything can be stopped. That's the point of this place." He turned and left the hall, the sound of his boots fading into the endless corridors. By afternoon, the fog outside had turned darker, as though the sky itself had aged. The world below the hill was gone completely now, nothing beyond the castle but gray. Clara waited until nightfall to move again. She carried only a single candle and the book she had found. She knew where to go now, or at least she thought she did. There was an old service stairway behind the laundry room, narrow and steep. Most of the steps were worn to dust. She descended slowly, one hand on the wall, the air growing colder with each step. The candlelight barely touched the edges of the stone. At the bottom, she found a door. It was small and unremarkable, made of plain wood, but it pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. The carvings on it were identical to the ones she had seen on the vanished door, vines curling in a spiral, meeting in the center. She set the candle down and pressed her hand to the wood. It was cold, but not dead. For a moment, she thought she heard voices behind it. Not words, just the rhythm of speech, hundreds of them, layered atop one another, whispering without pause. She pushed. The door didn't move. She tried again, harder. Nothing. Then she remembered the book. On the final page, under the phrase about what lies below, there was a circle drawn around a symbol that looked like an open eye. She traced it on the door with her finger. The wood shivered. The whispers stopped, and the door opened. Inside was a stairway descending into blackness. The air that came out was colder than winter, and it smelled faintly of dust and rain. Clara hesitated, looking back. The candle on the floor burned without a flame, just a steady golden glow. She whispered, "Find the door beneath time," and stepped inside. The door closed behind her without sound. The stairs spiraled downward, narrower with each turn. The air grew denser, heavier, until it felt like she was walking through the breath of something enormous. She began to hear it, the faint ticking that had haunted the castle for so long. But now it was louder, clearer. Not the ticking of a clock, but of a heart. And then she saw it. At the bottom of the stairway was a vast circular chamber, carved from the rock itself. The ceiling was lost in darkness. In the center stood a massive clock, or what looked like one. But instead of numbers, its face was carved with symbols that shimmered faintly, and its hands were made of light. It wasn't built to tell time. It was built to hold it. The light pulsed slowly, like breathing, and around its base were hundreds of figures. People perfectly still, their faces calm, their eyes closed. She recognized some of them. Martine, Gerard, the doctor, even the merchant, all standing frozen, as though waiting for something. When she stepped closer, their chests rose and fell in perfect unison. The great clock's light brightened, and above it, carved into the stone, were the same 5 words she had seen on her window. Find the door beneath time. It wasn't a message. It was a command, and she had obeyed. The air in the chamber moved like breath, slow, deliberate, alive. Each pulse of light from the great clock rippled across the walls, illuminating the carved symbols in faint gold. The shapes looked almost like veins, branching, curling, feeding into the mechanism at the center. The light brightened with each cycle, and Clara realized it wasn't reflecting off the stone. It was coming from it. She stepped closer, her footsteps echoing softly in the vast silence. The figures around the clock didn't stir. They stood in concentric rings, perfectly spaced, like worshippers around an altar. Their faces were calm, too calm. No lines of worry or fatigue, no marks of time. Each one looked preserved, untouched, waiting. Clara reached out and touched Martine's sleeve. It was warm, the skin beneath it soft. Not statues, not dead, breathing. She staggered back, her heartbeat crashing in her ears. She wanted to call their names, to shake them awake. But something in the air warned her not to. Every sound seemed to echo too far, traveling up the stone walls and vanishing into the dark. It felt as though the chamber itself was listening. The great clock's hands shifted slightly, emitting a faint chime that wasn't a note so much as a vibration that moved through her bones. And then, for the briefest moment, time moved differently. The candlelight in her hand stretched, stilled, and then flickered again. Her breath hung frozen before her face. Her pulse paused between beats. When motion returned, it brought sound with it. A whisper that came not from one voice but from many. "You shouldn't have come." Clara turned sharply. The figures around her were still unmoving, their eyes closed. The whisper had come from nowhere and everywhere. "I had to," she said aloud, her voice trembling. "You're trapped. All of you." The whisper answered, calm and endless. "Not trapped. Preserved." The air grew colder. She could see her breath now. The faint mist drifted toward the clock's face, dissolving as it touched the light. "Why?" she whispered. "What is this place?" And for the first time, a single voice rose above the chorus. It was Martine's. "The heart," it said softly. "He built it to stop the end." Clara turned toward her, but Martine's eyes were still closed. Her lips did not move. "He?" Clara asked. "Etienne?" "Yes," the voice breathed. "He feared the world's noise, so he made this a place where nothing changes. But to hold stillness, something must feed it." Clara's stomach turned. "Feed it," The living, Martine's voice said. We are the rhythm. Every breath, every heartbeat, the clock takes it. It counts us until nothing is left to count. The light pulsed again, and Clara saw it. Faint strands of gold, like threads of light, stretching from each of the standing figures into the base of the clock. Energy flowed along them in steady pulses, drawn from bodies that never aged. She took a step back. No! The whisper surrounded her. You are part of it now. Clara's candle went out. The chamber dimmed, lit only by the slow, pulsing glow of the clock. And from the darkness above, footsteps began to echo, calm, deliberate, descending the stairs. Tien. He appeared as if he'd been waiting for her to find it. His face was paler than ever, his eyes reflecting the golden light. So you've seen it, he said quietly. Good. It's time you understood. What have you done? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. He walked past her, to the edge of the clock's base, and laid a hand on the stone. The light brightened at his touch, like recognition. Do you know what the world is like now? He said softly. Noise, fire, revolt. I built this to preserve peace. This clock is the measure of eternity. It keeps the world still, one breath at a time. You're stealing their lives, she said. I'm saving them, he replied calmly. Do you think they suffered? Look at them. No hunger, no pain, no grief, just quiet. They're not living. He turned to her then, his face almost kind. Life is chaos, Clara. Death is order. I've simply given them the mercy of both. Something deep within the mechanism groaned. A long, low sound like metal shifting after centuries. Etienne looked up. His calm wavered for the first time. It's waking, he said softly. The clock's light intensified, and the symbols on the walls began to move, slowly rotating, aligning with one another. The vines she'd seen on the doors above were etched here too, and they were glowing now, golden lines converging toward the clock's center. What happens when it wakes? Clara asked. Etienne didn't look at her. It resets. The word hit her like cold water. Resets. He nodded. Everything. The world above. The valley. The sky. This castle was built on the edge of time itself. When the heart stops, the world starts again. Clean. Silent. Perfect. Clara took a step back. You can't. There's a world out there. People. They've forgotten how to live, he said. This will give them peace. She shook her head. You're not saving the world, Etienne. You're erasing it. He sighed softly, like a teacher disappointed in his pupil. Peace always feels like loss to those who love noise. He reached into his coat and pulled out the small brass clock she'd seen him carry before, the one with the trembling hands. He placed it on the edge of the great clock's base. This one measures me, he said quietly. When it stops, the reset begins. He looked at her, his expression suddenly tired. You can stay if you wish. The heart welcomes all. Then he turned and began to climb the stairs. Clara watched him go, her pulse racing. Around her, the still figures began to stir. Not moving, not waking, but shifting slightly, as though reacting to the clock's growing hum. The light was brighter now, flooding the room in gold. The air trembled. She ran to the brass clock on the edge of the base. His hands were spinning faster, blurring into motion. Martine, she whispered. What happens if it stops? The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Then everything ends. She looked up at the vast mechanism. The light was spreading up the walls, filling every vein, every carving. There was only one thought left in her mind. She had to stop it before he did. There's a strange kind of courage that comes when you realize everything around you isn't real, or at least not alive the way it pretends to be. Clara felt it now. Not bravery exactly, but that sharp, clear calm that only arrives when the fear has burned itself out. The great clock loomed before her, its light pulsing like a heartbeat that didn't belong to the earth. Every figure in the chamber stood still, their bodies faintly glowing as the threads of gold connected them to the mechanism. Time wasn't passing here. It was being stored, harvested, wound into eternity like silk, and she was standing in the middle of it, the only thing that dared to move. The small brass clock Etienne had left ticked madly on the ledge, its hands spinning faster and faster, a blur of motion that hurt to look at. It was counting down to something. She didn't know what, but she could feel it pressing against the air. She took a breath, then another. If the castle was feeding on the stillness of its people, then the only way to break it was to feed it something it couldn't digest. Movement, chaos, life. She reached up and grabbed one of the golden threads that connected Martine to the clock. It was warm, almost alive, and pulsed in rhythm with Martine's unmoving chest. For a moment, Clara hesitated. The thread looked fragile, like a string of light that might shatter at a touch. But when she pulled, it didn't break. It resisted, stretching slightly before drawing tight again. "Martine," she whispered, "wake up." The voice that answered came from everywhere. "You can't wake the still. I have to try." She pulled harder. The golden thread brightened, flared, and then snapped. The sound wasn't loud. It was more like a sigh, a long exhale of something that had been waiting for release. Martine's body trembled once, like a sleeper startled in a dream. Her eyes opened, only they weren't eyes anymore. The gold light that had filled the thread now glowed behind them, flickering like fire trapped behind glass. She looked at Clara but didn't see her. Her mouth opened, and when she spoke, her voice came in two tones. One human, one mechanical. "You shouldn't have done that." Clara stepped back, heart hammering. I wanted to free you." Martine blinked slowly, the glow fading slightly. "You can't free what isn't bound. We were given peace. You've torn it." Around the chamber, the other figures began to move, slowly at first. A turn of the head, a twitch of a hand, then faster, as though the breaking of one thread had loosened them all. The golden lines trembled, pulsing wildly, some flickering out, others burning brighter. The hum of the clock deepened, turning into a low, resonant growl that shook the floor. Clara turned back to the central mechanism. The great clock's face was spinning, the hands rotating violently, the light flaring with every rotation. The walls around her rippled. Dust fell from the ceiling. She ran to the brass clock, grabbed it with both hands. It burned against her palms, hot enough to sear, but she didn't let go. The hands inside it blurred faster and faster until they vanished. And then the world stopped. It wasn't silence this time. It was absence, the kind that makes your thoughts echo. The chamber froze mid-motion, Martine's hand reaching forward, the threads mid-sway, the golden light suspended like liquid caught in air. Clara stood alone in the only moving thing left. She looked up. The great clock had gone dark. Its face, once glowing with rhythm, was now dull stone. And in that instant, she realized what she'd done. She hadn't freed them. She'd broken the mechanism that held the castle together. The stillness cracked. A sound tore through the chamber. Not noise, but pressure. The stone walls shuddered, groaned, and split. Fissures raced up from the floor to the ceiling, spilling out light that wasn't gold anymore but white, pure and blinding. The light poured out like water, flooding over everything it touched. The figures around the clock began to crumble, not into dust, but into air. Their bodies dissolved, their shapes fading, their faces finally at rest. Martine looked at Clara one last time. For a heartbeat, her eyes were her own again. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she was gone. The threads snapped one by one, each release shaking the ground. The sound built until it was unbearable, the kind of sound that has no source, no direction, just presence. Clara covered her ears, but it made no difference. From the staircase above, Etienne's voice carried down, calm and steady even as the world fell apart. "You don't understand, Clara. You've set it free." She looked up. He was descending slowly, his black coat trailing behind him like smoke. But his face, it was changing. The calm lines were breaking, the skin fracturing like porcelain, light leaking through the cracks. He stepped into the chamber, the glow spilling from the walls reflecting in his eyes. "The heart of stillness was never a prison," he said. "It was a boundary. It kept time contained." "What are you talking about?" He gestured to the great clock, which was now splitting down the center, the light pouring out in waves. "You've torn the veil. The stillness isn't ending, Clara. It's escaping." The ground shook harder. The air shimmered, bending. The light rose higher, spreading like dawn, touching the stairways, the corridors above. She could hear things collapsing in the distance. Furniture, walls, maybe entire rooms being swallowed by it. Etienne walked toward the base of the clock and placed his hand against it. "It's too late to stop it now," he said softly. "But perhaps, for a moment, you'll see what peace truly looks like." Clara backed away. "You can't mean..." He looked at her, smiling faintly even as the light consumed his hands, his arms. "You wanted to wake us. Now you'll wake everything." And with that, the chamber exploded in light. It wasn't fire. It wasn't destruction. It was stillness expanding outward, a silent wave that turned movement into memory. The castle above shuddered, its towers fracturing like glass, its walls dissolving into mist. The fog that surrounded the hill thickened, spreading outward, swallowing the valley, the forests, the sky. And then, for a single heartbeat, there was nothing. And in that nothing, a sound, one single perfect tick. Then everything started again. The first thing Clara noticed was the color. It wasn't the heavy gold or fog gray she had grown used to. It was light, clean, almost blue. She blinked and realized she was lying in grass. Real grass. It bent beneath her fingers when she moved. The smell hit her next. Earth, damp and sweet, the scent of morning after rain. When she sat up, there was nothing on the horizon. Just rolling hills and a pale sky. The castle was gone. No towers, no walls, not even ruins. The hill itself seemed smaller, as if the land had exhaled and relaxed after centuries of holding its breath. She stood slowly, her legs weak. There was no sound of ticking, only the faint whisper of wind through grass. For the first time in she didn't know how long, the air didn't hum. She turned in a slow circle. The world was empty but not dead. Felt paused, as if the moment she had broken the clock had stopped everything for just a little while. The light above her didn't move. The sun hung still in a white sky. She called out once, her voice startlingly loud against the quiet. "Hello!" It echoed. No answer. Then, from somewhere behind her, a voice said softly, "You shouldn't be here yet." Clara turned sharply. Martine stood a few feet away, or at least, something that looked like Martine. Her outline shimmered faintly, transparent around the edges, her dress rippling like reflection on water. "You," Clara whispered. "You're gone. You." Martine smiled gently. "I was part of the stillness. When it broke, we scattered. Some of us stayed near the seam." The seam, the place where time tore. Clara looked around again. "Where is everyone?" "Everywhere," Martine said. "Now that the heart has opened, There's no inside or outside. There's only what's left. Clara's throat tightened. I didn't mean for this to happen. I know. Martine's voice was kind. But something had to change. Even peace can rot. A breeze stirred the grass. The light shifted slightly, barely enough to notice, but Clara saw it and her chest tightened. The sun had moved, just a little. The world was remembering how to turn. Martine looked upward too. It begins again. Clara stepped closer. What happens now? You walk, Martine said. You remember. The stillness will try to find you again. But it can't if you keep moving. Moving where? Martine smiled faintly, already fading. Anywhere. The world's wide again. Then she was gone, dissolving into light. Clara stood alone. The wind grew stronger, carrying the scent of salt. Far in the distance, she saw what looked like a shoreline. Pale waves against dark sand. She began walking. Each step felt heavier, realer. The ground gave slightly beneath her boots. Her heartbeat found a rhythm again. After a while, she started humming. Not a song she remembered, just a sound. Something to fill the silence. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt uncertain, still reassembling itself. The landscape shifted subtly as she walked. Shades deepening, clouds forming, the horizon widening. The stillness was losing its hold. Life was creeping back in. When she reached the shore, the ocean was calm and vast. It looked untouched, endless. She knelt, dipped her hand into the water, and felt it move around her fingers. Cold, flowing, alive. Then she saw something glinting in the sand. She dug it out carefully. A small brass clock. Hien's. It wasn't ticking, but its hands were frozen at the exact moment she had pulled the golden thread in the chamber. The glass was cracked, and through it she could see faint light pulsing beneath the surface, like an ember refusing to die. She held it up to her ear. Silence. Then faintly one tick. Another. Slow, deliberate. The waves seemed to pause with each sound. Clara closed her eyes. No, she whispered. Not again. She threw the clock into the sea. It arced once through the air, flashing gold in the sunlight, then vanished beneath the surface. The ocean rippled once, then stilled. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the wind shifted again, stronger this time. The waves began to move, crashing softly against the shore. A gull cried somewhere overhead. The sky deepened into true blue. The sun moved again, slow but steady. The world was waking up. Clara sat there until the tide touched her feet. For the first time in what felt like centuries, she felt tired, not the endless exhaustion of stillness, but the good kind, the kind that comes from living, from breathing, from change. When she finally rose, she looked back toward where the castle had once stood. The hill was empty, covered in wildflowers. No towers, no walls. Only a faint shimmer in the air where the light bent differently, like a scar that time hadn't yet decided to hide. She turned away and started walking again. Behind her, far out at sea, a faint sound echoed, one single soft tick, and then the water closed over it forever. The world moved on. The world was a canvas without detail. Everywhere Clara went, it felt as though the air was still learning how to exist again. Trees grew without shadows, rivers flowed without sound, and the sky, too bright, too soft, looked like it had been painted by memory instead of weather. She had been walking for days, though the sun hadn't set once. There was no night anymore, just light shifting in temperature, warm when she was still, cold when she moved. It didn't make sense, but then, nothing ever had since the castle disappeared. Every now and then, she saw fragments of what had been. A stretch of cobblestone road that ended abruptly in grass. A door frame standing alone. Once, She even found a chandelier lying half-buried in a field, the crystals still shimmering faintly as though remembering candlelight. The world wasn't broken. It was rebuilding, but it wasn't sure what to make of itself. She came across a small village, or what looked like one. The houses were there, but hollow, their windows filled with mist. When she stepped closer, the shapes inside them flickered. People or echoes of people moving in the same slow loops. A woman pouring tea that never filled the cup. A child reaching for a toy that wasn't there. They didn't see her. They just repeated their motions again and again. Clara stood at the edge of the village, her heart heavy. This wasn't freedom. It was aftermath. A sound carried on the wind, then soft, rhythmic, distant. Tick, tick. She froze. It wasn't from the sea this time. It was coming from within the earth. Faint, patient, unstoppable. She followed it. The sound led her beyond the village, through a grove of half-formed trees, their leaves translucent, their trunks humming softly. And there, at the base of a hill, she found a door. Not a castle door. A simple wooden one, standing upright in the ground, unattached to any wall. Its surface was familiar. The same curling vine-like carvings that had haunted her dreams. The first door. She approached slowly, her fingers trembling. The air around it was cold, too cold. The grass had frozen into glass where it touched the frame. "Not again," she whispered. The ticking grew louder. She pressed her hand to the wood. Pulsed once, alive. "Clara!" She spun. Etienne stood behind her. Not solid, but not gone either. His shape flickered like light seen through moving water. His voice, though, was the same, measured, calm, unhurried. "You survived," he said. Clara's throat tightened. "You shouldn't be here." He smiled faintly. "Neither should you." The air between them trembled. He stepped closer, his form wavering with each movement. "Do you see what you've done? The world isn't free. It's lost. You didn't destroy stillness. You released it." She shook her head. "No, I said it right. Time is moving again." Etienne gestured toward the frozen grass, the looping figures in the village. "Is it? Look around you. They're not living. They're echoes. Fragments of rhythm without meaning. You broke the heart, but not its hunger. The stillness wants to belong somewhere. And it found you." The words hit like cold rain. "You're lying." He tilted his head. "You think so? Then why hasn't the sun set since you woke up?" Clara looked at the horizon. The light had shifted again, but it was still day, endless, flat, eternal. Her stomach twisted. The realization was slow, cruel. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't possible." Etienne's face softened. "You tore open the heart, Clara." The stillness seeped through the cracks. "You're standing in the echo of the world, not its rebirth." He stepped closer until she could see the flickering lines of light running beneath his skin. "You can stop it," he said. "You can rebuild the boundary. The door is still listening." "I won't trap people again," she said. "Never." His eyes, pale and endless, met hers. "Then everything ends. The noise, the wind, the breath of things. Stillness doesn't vanish. It waits. And when the last sound fades, it takes what remains." Clara's hands shook. The ticking was louder now, resonating through her chest. She looked down and saw faint golden threads wrapping around her wrists. Thin lines of light, pulsing gently. They led back to the door. "No," she whispered. "Not me." Etienne smiled sadly. "It always begins with the one who broke it." He stepped back, fading into the air. "When the clock stops, the world will sigh. And in that sigh, you'll hear peace again." Then he was gone. The wind stopped. The sky went flat. Only the ticking remained. Clara stared at the door. It was beautiful in a terrible way, the carvings alive, twisting gently, the center glowing faintly gold. The sound came from within, steady as breath. She thought of Martine, of Gerard, of the frozen faces beneath the castle. She thought of stillness dressed as peace. And she whispered, "Not again." Then she ran. She didn't know where to, just away from the ticking, away from the light. The ground rippled under her feet, shifting between grass and stone and sand. The air shimmered like heat. The world was folding, trying to close itself again. Behind her, the door began to open. The sound it made wasn't wood. It was time itself groaning. Clara didn't look back. She ran until her lungs burned and the sky cracked open above her like a mirror splitting down the center. And then silence. Pure, absolute, endless silence. She fell to her knees, gasping. The horizon flickered. The light dimmed. And from somewhere very far away, she heard Martine's voice again, softer this time. "Keep moving, child. Don't let it find you." Clara closed her eyes. The wind returned, faint but real. The ticking faded. For now, when she opened her eyes, she was standing on a road lined with wildflowers. The world was still strange, still too bright, but it was moving again. The flowers bent in the wind. A cloud passed. Somewhere, faint and fragile, a bird sang. She smiled, just a little, and kept walking. For days Clara walked. She didn't know where the road led, or if it even led anywhere at all, but walking gave her something to measure, something to believe in. Her steps made sound. Her shadow stretched and shifted with the strange half-light. Each small reminder that the world could still move was enough to keep her going. She began to notice other traces of life along the road, though life might not be the right word for it. Sometimes she found footprints, but they were faint, fading into the earth as if time was still deciding whether they belonged to anyone. Other times she saw shapes in the distance. People, perhaps, but when she got closer, they blurred, shimmering like heat haze, then disappeared. But one evening, when the air had grown thick and the wind had stopped again, she heard voices. They were faint at first, whispers carried on the wind. She followed them cautiously, the ground crunching softly under her boots. The voices grew louder, clearer, and then she saw them. A small group gathered around what looked like a fire, except it wasn't fire. It was light, steady, golden, breathing in the same rhythm as the castle's heart once had. There were 4 of them. They looked human but slightly wrong. Too still when they sat, too slow when they blinked. They didn't speak until she stepped closer, and then all 4 turned to look at her at the same time. The tallest among them stood. His face was familiar. "Gerard," she whispered. The butler smiled faintly, his eyes glowing faintly gold. "Clara." His voice was soft, measured, the same as it had been in the castle. "You woke the world." She hesitated. "You're alive." In a manner of speaking, he gestured toward the light. "We survived the breaking. Some of us were too entangled in the stillness to dissolve. We carry its echo now." Clara stepped closer to the light. It pulsed in slow, even waves, reflecting faintly in Gerard's eyes. "What is that?" "The residue of the heart," he said. "It followed us. It still wants to feed." One of the others, a woman Clara didn't recognize, spoke up. Her voice was soft, hollow. "We call it the ember. Keeps us warm. It keeps us quiet." Clara stared at it. The light was hypnotic, peaceful, almost inviting. But beneath the calm was something deeper, something pulling like gravity. She could feel it in her chest, tugging gently at her heartbeat, trying to match its rhythm to its own. She stepped back. "You can't stay near it. It'll take you again." The woman smiled sadly. "Maybe that's better." Gerard looked at Clara for a long moment. You broke the clock, Clara, but you didn't break the design. Still looking for balance. It needs stillness to survive. If we keep running, it will follow us. But if we stand still long enough, it might sleep again. She shook her head. No, that's what he said. That's what Etienne believed, that peace means stopping. He was wrong. Gerard's smile didn't change. Perhaps, but peace is easier than noise. Clara's chest tightened. She recognized the tone, the slow resignation of someone who had given up the habit of choosing. It was the same voice she'd heard in the castle before the silence swallowed everyone. You're not him, she said softly. Don't let it turn you into him. Gerard looked into the golden light. I don't think we have a choice anymore. She reached for him. Then leave it. Come with me. The others stirred slightly, watching her with that same patient calm. Gerard didn't move. The heart of stillness doesn't just live in the castle anymore, he said quietly. It's inside us now. You can't outrun what's in you. Clara's voice cracked. You can fight it. Can you? He asked. She didn't answer. The golden light flared once, brighter, and when it dimmed, Gerard and the others were gone. The fire still burned, but the air where they'd sat was empty. Only a faint shimmer remained, fading slowly into the wind. Clara fell to her knees. The ground was cold, the silence pressing in again. For a moment, she almost wanted to stop moving, to sit by the light and let it take her too. It would be easy. No more fear, no more loneliness, just stillness. But then she remembered Martine's voice. Keep moving, child. She stood. The world around her seemed to hum faintly, waiting. She turned away from the ember and began walking again. The road ahead was different now. The grass was greener. The air felt heavier, more solid. The horizon glowed with faint color, pale pink, like dawn struggling to remember how to exist. It struck her that maybe this was what rebirth looked like. Not sudden or perfect, but awkward and uncertain. As she walked, she saw movement again. Not echoes this time, but real movement. The figure far ahead, walking too. She couldn't see their face, but their steps were steady, deliberate. She called out, but the wind swallowed her voice. She followed. When she finally reached the bend in the road, the figure was gone. But in the dirt where they'd walked, there were footprints, fresh ones, not fading like the others, real. Clara knelt, touching one with her fingers. The soil was warm. She wasn't the only one moving after all. Somewhere behind her, faint and patient, the ticking began again. But this time she didn't run. She just kept walking, her heartbeat steady, matching it beat for beat. Because maybe the answer wasn't to escape the ticking or to stop it. Maybe the answer was to live through it. The road eventually ended. Not in ruin or wilderness, but in something far stranger. It stopped at the edge of what looked like a town, though not quite. The structures were too perfect, the streets too straight. Everything had the symmetry of something freshly imagined rather than built. The air there had a stillness Clara hadn't felt since the castle. And when she stepped closer, she understood why. The town was empty, not abandoned, unfinished. Buildings stood in precise rows, each identical to the next. Their windows had no glass. The doors were outlines painted in gray. The streets were paved with smooth stone that bore no cracks. Nowhere, no history. It looked like the memory of a town that hadn't decided to exist yet. And above it all, in the very center, something tall was taking shape. Scaffolding, beams, half-formed towers reaching toward the sky. Clara stopped breathing for a moment. She didn't need to see more. She knew what it was trying to become. A castle. But not the one she'd destroyed. This one was brighter, cleaner, almost inviting, like a reflection of the old one scrubbed free of guilt. She whispered, No, no, not again. As if the words carried weight, the air shifted. The sound of construction drifted faintly through the stillness. Hammers striking, wood creaking. Though there were no workers, no motion, no dust. The sound came from nowhere, looping endlessly. She stepped closer, her boots echoing softly against the flawless stone. Each house she passed looked the same inside. A table, 2 chairs, a lamp that glowed faintly but cast no shadow. The air smelled of lavender. Familiar, too familiar. The smell brought back nights in the castle's halls. The slow rhythm of servants polishing silver that no one used. The whisper of torches that burned too quietly. This new place had that same pulse, that same hidden heartbeat. It was growing. She reached the base of the new tower, her reflection bending faintly in the pale metal beams. They weren't iron or stone, but something smoother, thinner, like glass given the memory of solidity. When she touched one, it hummed. The sound was faint, but the rhythm was unmistakable. Tick, tick, tick. Her hand trembled. "Don't build this," she whispered to the air. "Don't do this again." No one answered, but the scaffolding vibrated slightly, as if considering her request. Then a voice came from behind her. "It isn't being built. It's remembering itself." She turned. A man stood there, tall, dressed in simple clothes, pale shirt, dark coat. His face was ordinary, but his eyes, they were calm in that particular way she had learned to fear. "You," she said. "Who are you?" He smiled faintly. "A caretaker once. Now perhaps an echo." The voice was familiar, but softer than Etienne's had been. "What is this place?" she asked. "The world is rebuilding its pattern," he said. "When you tore the stillness, it didn't vanish. Scattered. Fragments of it lingered. Memories, order, symmetry. The world doesn't know how to exist without walls, Clara. It always tries to rebuild them." She shook her head. "It doesn't have to. It can stay free." "Freedom is noise," he said gently, "and noise always finds its way back to silence." She stepped closer, anger rising despite the quiet. "This isn't silence. It's control." He looked at her for a long time. "Does it matter? If people find peace in repetition, if they choose to forget, who are you to wake them?" The question struck deeper than she wanted to admit. He tilted his head. "You destroyed the old heart, yes, but something must always take its place. Nature abhors a vacuum, even time." She looked up at the growing tower. The light at its base pulsed faintly, that same gold she had seen beneath the castle. She whispered, "It's happening again." He nodded. "Slowly, yes, but this time it may not need a master. The world itself remembers how to be still." The thought chilled her more than Etienne ever had. She took another step toward the tower, her voice low and trembling. "If I stop it again, will it ever stay gone?" He smiled sadly. "Do you stop breathing because it hurts?" She turned away from him and began climbing the scaffold. Each rung was cold, humming faintly under her touch. The light brightened as she climbed higher. Below her, the empty streets stretched out like a chessboard, identical, precise, waiting for players who had yet to exist. When she reached the halfway point, she saw it. At the top of the tower, a sphere of light was forming, small, steady, golden. The heart was rebuilding itself. She stood there for a long time, wind whispering through the hollow beams. The logical part of her mind knew what would happen next. The light would grow, the stillness would spread, and everything she had fought for would fade into another illusion of peace. But the other part, the tired part, the one that remembered endless running, endless noise, whispered something different. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad to rest again. Her grip loosened slightly. The hum of the tower deepened, like a sigh of anticipation. Then, from far below, a sound, faint, small, human. "Clara!" She froze. It was a child's voice, clear, frightened. She looked down. At the edge of the empty street stood a small figure, a girl in a white dress, waving her arms. The light from the tower reflected in her hair. For a moment, the world felt real again. The girl called again, "Don't let it finish." And just like that, the fatigue left her. Clara took a deep breath and began climbing faster. The hum grew louder, the light blinding. She reached the top and saw the sphere pulsing, spinning, gathering itself into form. She didn't think. She reached out both hands and plunged them into the light. It was cold, and then everything went silent. The light exploded outward in a flash so bright it erased the world. The town vanished, the scaffolding dissolved, and Clara felt herself falling, weightless, endless, through a world without air. The last thing she heard before everything faded was the child's voice again. "Keep moving." Then there was nothing but dark. And somewhere, faint and far away, a new clock began to tick. When consciousness returned, it did so like light seeping under a closed door. Slow, hesitant, uncertain if it should enter at all. Clara opened her eyes to find herself in a bed. A real bed. The sheets were soft, warm, and smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. For a moment she didn't move. She just lay there, breathing, letting the air settle around her. There was no humming, no ticking, no glow behind her eyelids. She sat up slowly. The room was small but tidy, with pale stone walls and a window that looked out onto a narrow street. Beyond it, she saw people, dozens of them, walking, talking, laughing. A baker carrying a tray of bread, children chasing a ball. A town, a real living town. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The sound of life, that ordinary noise, hit her like a wave. After so long in silence, it was almost overwhelming. She pushed the covers aside and stood. Her legs felt steady. There was weight in them again. Gravity. She touched the window pane. It was cool, solid. Outside, the world moved. The sky shifted colors. Birds crossed the rooftops. For the first time since she could remember, time was visible again. Someone knocked gently on the door. "Come in," she said automatically. A young woman entered, smiling warmly. "Ah, you're awake. We weren't sure you'd be strong enough to get up today." Clara frowned. "Today?" "Yes," the woman said. "You've been resting for nearly a week. You were found near the river. The doctor said you were exhausted. No memory of how you got there, though." The words hit softly, like ripples. The river. She remembered water, light, and falling, but not landing. "Where am I?" she asked. "Saint Morel," the woman said. "Just south of the capital. Don't worry, you're safe here." "Safe." Clara nodded slowly. "Thank you." The woman smiled again and left, the door closing quietly behind her. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. Saint Morel. She had never heard of it, but the world outside the window looked familiar enough. Carriages, cobblestones, the muted elegance of the late 18th century felt too familiar. She turned to the small clock on the bedside table. Brass, polished, perfectly ordinary. Its hands showed 11 o'clock. She watched it for a minute, then two. The hands didn't move. Her pulse quickened. She stood, walked to the window again. The people outside were still moving, laughing, working, talking. But somehow, their gestures seemed wrong. Their movements repeated just slightly. A woman dropped her basket, knelt to pick it up, and then dropped it again. The baker wiped his brow, turned, wiped it again. The world was looping, not freezing this time, repeating. The illusion was subtler now. No silence, no stillness. Just endless rhythm disguised as normal life. Clara closed her eyes. "No," she whispered. No, not again. When she opened them, the sky outside had shifted color slightly. The same loop, the same moment wearing a different mask. She turned back to the clock. It was still 11 o'clock. The second hand trembled faintly, as though trying to move but unable to commit. Someone knocked again. Clara didn't answer. The door opened slowly. A man stepped in, older, thin, gray at the temples. He wore a doctor's coat and carried a small notebook. His expression was calm, his eyes kind, too kind. Ah, he said softly. You're awake. Clara stared. Who are you? He smiled faintly. Dr. Lemaire. I've been looking after you. Something about his tone chilled her. What year is it? 1787, he said smoothly. Why? She stepped back. That's impossible. He tilted his head. Is it? The air in the room felt thicker. Where is Etienne? She asked suddenly. The doctor's smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened just slightly. You've been dreaming, my dear. There's no Etienne here. No castle either. You've been ill. He turned toward the clock on the table, adjusted it gently. The hands trembled, trying to move. You see? Everything's fine now. The clock ticked once. Clara's stomach dropped. He smiled again, and for just a heartbeat, she saw it. The faintest shimmer of gold under his skin, a thread of light pulsing along his neck like a vein. She whispered, No. He stepped closer. You need rest. It's been a long journey. She shook her head, backing toward the window. You're not real. He sighed softly. Real enough. He placed a hand on the clock. Ticking grew louder, sharper, faster. The world outside the window slowed. The children stopped mid-laugh. The baker froze mid-step. The air held still again. Dr. Lemaire looked at her, his voice calm and even. Peace, Clara. You've earned it. She grabbed the clock and threw it. It hit the wall, shattered, and the ticking stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the doctor smiled, a slow, knowing smile. It doesn't matter. There's always another. He faded, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the faint smell of lavender. Clara fell to her knees, gasping. The room flickered. The street outside shifted, replayed, reset. She whispered, You can't have me. Not again. The window shattered. Wind howled through, scattering glass like dust. The town flickered, whole, then empty, then whole again. She climbed through the broken window, dropped to the street below, and started running. Behind her, the clock tower at the end of the street struck once. The sound echoed through the looping air, folding time on itself. And when she looked back, the tower wasn't there anymore. In its place, a doorway stood, tall, carved with curling vines. Waiting. The doorway stood in the middle of the street, impossibly tall, its edges pulsing with a faint gold light. The curling vine patterns were sharper this time, almost alive, their tips twitching like tendrils searching for breath. Every other trace of the town had gone still, people, buildings, even the air. But the door waited, vibrating softly, humming with a rhythm that Clara recognized immediately. The heartbeat of the castle. She took a single step forward. The sound of her boots on the cobblestones echoed far too loudly, as if the world around her had been emptied of everything but her and the door. Not this time, she whispered, but the whisper was enough to wake it. The carvings brightened, veins of light spreading outward, curling along the street and up the walls of the frozen buildings. The glow painted the world in slow-moving gold, and the air thickened with that same slow pulse. Time was starting to slow again, drawn back into the same rhythm she'd broken. And then she heard it. A voice, low, patient, calm. Not Etienne's, but close. You keep running, Clara, but you always end up here. She turned slowly. The figure stepped out of the light. It wore a cloak that shimmered faintly, the same color as the golden veins crawling across the ground. Its face shifted with each heartbeat, sometimes Etienne's, sometimes Martine's, sometimes her own. It smiled with all of them. "I am not him," the voice said. "He was just the first to understand me." Clara swallowed. "You're the stillness." The figure tilted its head. "I am what remains when everything else ends. You tried to destroy me, but you can't destroy absence. You only make more space for it." The air trembled around the words. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Why always me?" "Because you move," it said simply. "And movement remembers me best. Every step you take pulls a little piece of me along. You gave me shape, Clara. You keep me alive." The ground shuddered softly. The vines of gold began to creep closer, spreading across her boots. She stepped back. "I won't be part of you." The stillness smiled, 100 faces flickering through its expression. "You already are. Every breath you take is a rhythm. Every rhythm ends. You can fight me, or you can rest." She shook her head. "No, you don't get to decide what peace means." The light around the door brightened, the hum deepening. "Then step through," it said. "See what your noise has built." Clara hesitated. The last time she'd obeyed a voice like that, she had walked straight into eternity. But she couldn't stay here, trapped in another frozen world pretending to live. She reached out, hand trembling, and touched the surface of the door. It wasn't wood, it was warm like skin. It pulsed once beneath her palm, and then it opened. The world beyond was white, endless and blinding, but soft, like fog wrapped in light. There was no ground, no sky, no horizon, just space. She stepped through before she could change her mind. The door closed behind her without a sound. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, she heard movement. Footsteps, whispers, laughter, the sound of people. She turned, and through the mist, shapes appeared. Hundreds of them. Faces she knew and faces she didn't. Martine, Gerard, the merchant, the cook, the servants, even Etienne, all standing together in the haze, their eyes open, calm. But this time they weren't frozen. They were breathing. Clara's chest tightened. "You're alive." Martine stepped forward, her expression gentle. "We're between," she said. "The world is still finding its rhythm. You gave it the chance to start again." Clara's eyes filled. "Then why are you here?" "Because something must hold the door open while the rest of you walk through," Martine said. "You broke the heart, but it will always need a keeper, a rhythm, a pulse to remind time to move." "No," Clara said softly. "No, not me. I can't stay." Etienne smiled faintly behind her. "You don't stay. You become." The mist around them thickened. The light pulsed once, twice, steady as a heartbeat. Clara could feel it inside her chest, matching her breath. She looked down and saw threads of gold spreading from her feet, curling outward like roots. They didn't hurt. They just felt right. She looked at Martine one last time. "Tell them to keep moving," she whispered. Martine nodded. "We will." The light grew stronger. The mist dissolved. And when it cleared, the hill where the castle once stood was empty again, except for wildflowers swaying in the wind and a single heartbeat echoing faintly beneath the ground. It wasn't the old stillness, cold and suffocating. It was gentle now, alive, balanced. Not silence, not noise, something between. And somewhere, far beyond the hill, a child chasing a ball stopped for a moment and smiled, though she didn't know why. She had heard something, a soft, steady rhythm, a heartbeat under the earth. The castle was gone. The hill was quiet. Seasons began to remember themselves again. Grass grew taller, winds changed direction, and clouds drifted as though they had somewhere to be. The world had relearned how to move. In the nearby villages, no one spoke of what had happened on the hill. Not because they had forgotten, but because remembering felt like standing too close to a wound that hadn't yet closed. They called the place Lusamal de la Terra, the earth's sleep, a name meant to sound poetic, though the children who whispered it at dusk never quite knew why it made them shiver. Every spring, wildflowers bloomed there earlier than anywhere else. They swayed without wind, and bees never landed on them. The locals said it was because the ground hummed too softly to be heard but too loudly to ignore. When people leaned close, they could swear they felt the faint rhythm of a heartbeat beneath the soil. And as always, stories grew where explanations failed. The first story said there had been a castle on that hill, a grand one, filled with noblemen and servants and the kind of quiet that only the rich could afford. One night, the lord of the castle had locked the gates, declaring that no one would ever leave again. He wanted peace, they said, and he got it. Centuries of it. The second story said it wasn't a castle at all, but a monastery built by monks who wanted to stop time from passing. They prayed so long and so perfectly that time, out of politeness, paused to listen. And the third story, Clara's story, wasn't told as much as felt. It drifted through the world like the echo of something everyone had once known. A reminder that peace, left alone too long, becomes its own kind of prison. Children grew up hearing the whispers but didn't believe them. Still, they avoided the hill. Animals didn't graze there. Carriages made detours around it. Even the birds flew higher when they passed above. The air above that place carried the taste of memory, sweet and heavy, like dust on sunlight. Years turned to decades. The revolution came and went. Kings fell, new rulers rose. The world learned new words for freedom and new ways to cage it. The people of the valley grew old. But every so often, someone would wander too close to Lusamal de la Terra and hear it, the faint, rhythmic pulse beneath their feet. A sound like a heartbeat, or like the last echo of a great clock. They always came back changed. Not frightened, just quiet. They spoke slower, slept longer, smiled more softly, as though some part of them had learned what it meant to rest without ending. And though no one remembered her name, Clara never really left. Some said they'd seen her ghost on misty mornings, standing at the top of the hill, her dress stirring though the air was still. She never looked sad, just patient, watching the world breathe. Time, for its part, didn't hold grudges, continued as it always had, sometimes rushing, sometimes stalling, always circling back to the same questions. What is peace? What is movement? What do we lose when we stop long enough to listen? The stories said that the heart beneath the hill never fully stopped beating. It was weaker now, quieter, but it was there. Not a prison anymore, just a memory of one. A rhythm that reminded the world that stillness and motion were never enemies, only partners taking turns. On certain nights, when the wind came from the north and the fog rolled down from the mountains, the villagers swore they could hear faint music from the hill, something like a lullaby played on a broken harp. They would pause, smile without meaning to, and continue their work. No one ever rebuilt on that land. Every attempt failed. Foundations cracked, crops withered, tools rusted faster than they should have. It was as if the earth had drawn its own boundary, an invisible gate that no one could pass without permission. The people respected it. Some called it cursed, others blessed. Most simply called it quiet, and in that quiet life carried on. Children were born, grew, and grew old. The hill faded from importance but not from existence. It became background, an ancient sigh beneath the noise of history, until one morning nearly 100 years later, a child found something at the edge of the hill. It was small, round, and made of brass. A clock, the glass cracked, the hands missing. When the boy picked it up, he thought he heard it sigh. a tiny, tired sound, like someone waking from a long sleep. He ran home to show his mother. She smiled, told him it was just an old trinket, and set it on the mantelpiece. But that night, when everyone in the house had gone to bed, the mother swore she heard it tick once. Just once. Then silence again. By the middle of the 19th century, the world had become louder. Factories groaned and hissed. Trains howled across the countryside. And even the quietest towns had learned to live with the hum of industry. Smoke replaced mist. The rhythm of machines replaced the rhythm of seasons. It seemed that motion had finally conquered stillness. But not everywhere. There was still the hill. Travelers passing through St. Morel often wrote about it, usually in the same breath as a shrug. A peculiar rise, one letter said. Nothing grows quite right there. Another mentioned that compasses behaved strangely near the summit. One even described how his watch had stopped halfway up and started again on the way down. Most people ignored these stories, but one man didn't. His name was Dr. Augustine Valroy, a historian with a fondness for the inexplicable. He'd written thick, unreadable books on forgotten sex, untranslatable manuscripts, and what he liked to call the architecture of memory. He had a reputation for asking the sort of questions that made other scholars stare at their shoes. When he first heard the rumors about Le Sommel de la Terre, he smiled faintly and said, "Ah, so the world remembers something after all." He arrived in St. Morel in the autumn of 1846. The town was quieter than he expected, its people polite but distant. When he asked about the hill, they gave him the same look they might give a man asking for directions to the afterlife. "It's not forbidden," the innkeeper told him carefully, "but it's not wise." Valroy laughed softly. "Wisdom rarely makes good history." He set out the next morning, notebook in hand, coat flapping in the wind. The climb was easy, though the air grew oddly still near the top. The grass was short, soft, and pale gold. No insects, no birds, only the faint hum of the wind, if it was wind at all. At the summit he found nothing, just an open field and the remains of what might once have been a stone wall, worn down to nubs by time. He frowned, kneeling to brush his hand across the earth. Warm. He pulled out his pocket watch, ticked once, then stopped. He waited. A minute passed. Then, faintly, another tick. Slower, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. He smiled. "Well now," he murmured, "you're still breathing." For the next few weeks, Valroy studied the hill obsessively. He camped at its base, charted the soil temperature, sketched the strange shapes of the wildflowers that grew there. He recorded his findings in neat handwriting that trembled slightly more each day. October 12th. There is a pulse beneath the ground. Not mechanical, not seismic. Biological. It accelerates when I stand close to the center. October 16th. Dreamt of a woman in white. She said, "Keep moving." Woke with dirt on my boots. October 19th. My pocket watch now refuses to leave the hour of 11. I have bought another. It does the same. The villagers began to talk. They said the doctor's voice could be heard at night, arguing with someone who never answered. They said his tent glowed faintly gold from within. They said the wildflowers had begun to bloom again, even though it was nearly winter. On October 21st, Valroy stopped coming down from the hill. The next morning, a shepherd found his tent empty. His notes lay scattered in the grass, pages flapping in the still air. The last entry read, October 20th. The ground is soft. I think she is still here. I heard her heartbeat. It sounded like time starting over. The villagers waited a few days, then burned his tent. They said it was bad luck to let something from the hill stay too long among the living. His papers, however, survived. Decades later, they would end up in the archives of the University at Lyon. where they were mostly ignored until a student translated them in 1892. The student, a young woman named Elodie Renault, wrote in the margin of one page, "If he truly heard her heartbeat, perhaps she isn't gone at all. Perhaps she became the rhythm itself." And that was how the story changed again. No longer was it a tale of a mad nobleman or a silent monastery. It became the story of the woman who keeps time. They said she had once lived in a castle that vanished because the world refused to move. They said her footsteps woke the earth. They said if you stood on the hill long enough and listened closely, you could hear her walking still, slow, steady, patient. A reminder that stillness was never the enemy. Only forgetting was. Elodie Renault was 22 when she found Dr. Valroy's notes in the university archive. They were filed under folkloric curiosities, which was where the librarians put anything they didn't know what to do with. Most of the folders there smelled faintly of mildew and disappointment. But this one was different. The handwriting was clean, deliberate. There were sketches of flowers that didn't exist, diagrams of soil layers annotated with heart rates, and at the end, the single line that refused to fade. I heard her heartbeat. It sounded like time starting over. She read it 3 times before closing the folder and whispering to herself, "Nonsense," but her voice trembled when she said it. Elodie was a rational girl. She studied history, not myth. She liked things that could be catalogued, measured, and footnoted. And yet, when she read the doctor's final words, something inside her moved, like a half-forgotten memory stirring from sleep. That night, she dreamt of a hill covered in golden grass, of wind that didn't move, of someone standing at the top, back turned, white dress swaying slightly, as if time itself were breathing around her. When she woke, she knew she would go there. She told no one. People laughed at that kind of thing in 1892. Rationality was fashionable. Believing in ghosts was not. The journey from Lyon to St. Morel took 2 days. The town was smaller now. Factories had closed, young people had left. Only the old ones remained, and they looked at Elodie with that same expression Valroy had once received. Polite, pitying, unwilling to speak. When she asked an old woman at the inn about the hill, the woman only said, "It's quieter there than it used to be." Elodie asked, "Quieter how?" The woman shrugged. "You'll hear it." The hill hadn't changed. Still gold, still too soft beneath the feet, still the kind of place where shadows refused to stay put. The wind died as she climbed. Her watch, a dainty silver piece she'd bought herself, began to tick slower, like a heartbeat sinking to something older. At the top, the grass bent slightly, though there was no breeze. She stood still for a long time. "Is anyone here?" she asked. Silence. Then faintly a sound. Tick. It wasn't mechanical. It was alive. It pulsed through the ground, up her legs, into her chest. For a moment, she thought it was her own pulse, but it wasn't. It was slower, steadier, more certain. She closed her eyes. "Clara?" she whispered. The name came to her without thought, like something whispered into her ear by the air itself. The ground beneath her hummed softly, and then she heard it, words, faint but clear, woven into the rhythm of the pulse. "Keep moving." Her eyes snapped open. The world around her shimmered, the horizon bending faintly. The grass turned brighter gold. For a moment, she saw shadows moving between the light figures, hundreds of them, walking slowly in a great circle around the hill. They weren't ghosts exactly. They were moments, memories, the leftovers of time itself. Elodie tried to step forward, but the ground resisted. Her feet felt heavier, her heartbeat sinking to the one beneath the soil. "Keep moving," the voice said again, stronger this time. "I can't," she whispered. "Then we'll stop together." The air thickened. The sky dimmed slightly, as if someone had turned the color down. She looked up and saw her. A woman standing at the top of the hill, not 5 paces away, dressed in white, hair loose, eyes calm. Clara. The woman's expression was neither kind nor cruel. It was patient, infinite, the kind of face time itself might wear when it grew tired of pretending to be anything else. "Why did you call me here?" Elodie asked. Clara tilted her head slightly. "You called yourself. Every time someone remembers, the door opens a little. You heard it. You followed it. That's how the stillness finds its next keeper." Elodie's voice cracked. "No, I'm not like him. I'm not staying." Clara stepped closer, and the air moved with her, soft as breath. "Neither was I." The world wavered again. The hill brightened, every blade of grass glowing faintly gold. The ground pulsed faster now, heartbeat merging with heartbeat. "You can fight it," Clara said, "or you can understand it." "What happens if I understand?" Clara's smile was faint, distant. "You stop needing to fight." The light reached its peak, so bright that Elodie had to close her eyes. When she opened them again, the hill was empty. The world was quiet. Her watch had stopped, but she was still there. Her notebook lay open beside her, and on its last page, in handwriting that wasn't hers, were 3 words. "Keep them moving." She didn't remember walking back to town, but she arrived at dusk. The people who saw her said she looked older, though she couldn't have aged more than a day. She spoke less, wrote more. When asked about the hill, she only said, "It's awake again." She left St. Morel a week later and never returned. But the townsfolk began to notice strange things afterward. Their clocks ran smoother. The air felt lighter. The grass on the hill swayed again. And on still nights, a soft hum could be heard from the fields. A sound like breathing, like pages turning, like a pen scratching across paper. A reminder that someone was still writing the rhythm of the world. By the turn of the 20th century, Elodie Renault had become a rumor. No one knew what had happened to her after she left St. Morel. Some said she became a recluse, living alone in a cottage near the coast. Others said she went mad and spent her last days writing nonsense about time and memory. And a few, the ones who'd read her notes, claimed she had simply walked into the sea one morning and never come back. But her papers survived. They always do, somehow. In 1908, a London publisher named Basil Hargreaves released an English translation of her collected journals, under the title The Woman Who Keeps Time. It was printed in a small run, 50 copies, meant for collectors of oddities and occult philosophy. But the book had a strange habit of finding people who weren't looking for it. It appeared in train compartments, in hotel lobbies, in second-hand stalls. People who bought it swore they didn't remember choosing it. They just found it in their hands. The writing itself was calm, scholarly, even dull in places. But between the measured observations about soil composition and regional myths, Elodie had hidden fragments of something else, phrases that seemed to move when read aloud, sentences that bent the rhythm of the reader's pulse. One reviewer in the Times called it a work that feels less written than dreamt. Another simply wrote, "It hums when you hold it too long." And so, like everything the stillness ever touched, it began to spread. By the 1920s, the book had found its way into scientific circles. Physicists were starting to talk about relativity, time dilation, and the strange ways in which the universe refused to behave properly. A few fringe thinkers, half scientists, half poets, started referring to Renault's principle, the idea that time could be softened, stretched, or stilled through collective memory. Of course, most dismissed it. Superstition wrapped in metaphor, they said, but not everyone. In 1931, a French physicist named Henri Delacour took a copy of the book to the hill itself. He called it a pilgrimage of the rational mind. What he found there never made it into his formal papers, but his private diary told another story. June 14th, The grass bends against the wind. I hear something like a slow metronome. June 15th. My instruments record no sound. Yet the vibration persists. It matches my heart. June 16th. When I closed my eyes, I saw a figure. White, blurred, familiar. She looked at me and the sound stopped. Asterisk. After that, Delacour never published again. He retired early, citing a growing disinterest in movement. He was found dead 5 years later, sitting at his desk, smiling faintly. His watch was still ticking. The world kept moving. Wars came. Empires fell. The air filled with engines and radios and voices. And yet, the story of the castle that nobody was allowed to leave remained, tucked between folklore and philosophy, never quite vanishing. Every few decades, someone would rediscover it. A writer here, a painter there, each convinced they were the first to feel the pull of that strange hill and its quiet rhythm. By the late 20th century, the myth had changed again. It wasn't a ghost story anymore. It was an allegory, a metaphor, a curiosity. The stillness had been domesticated, turned into art and analysis. But legends have a way of remembering themselves. In 1998, a group of graduate students from Lyon University, 4 in total, decided to recreate Volroy's experiment for a documentary about forgotten myths. They brought cameras, monitors, and enough caffeine to defy sleep for days. On the first night, the footage showed laughter, jokes, boredom. By the second night, it grew quieter. The air around their tent began to distort slightly, barely visible but real. Their voices slowed down, even on tape. The final recording lasted only 43 seconds. A girl's voice, calm, measured, saying, "Keep them moving." Then static. When the search party reached the site, they found nothing but the tent and a small, round clock lying in the grass. His hands pointed to 11. The footage, of course, was archived and forgotten, but rumors spread anyway, and like before, new stories sprouted from the silence. The hill became sacred again, this time to believers in energy, in frequency, in the metaphysics of time. People claimed the earth there could heal them. Others swore it could make them disappear. The government fenced it off in 2003 after 3 separate disappearances. The press called it Le Terrain du Silence. The locals went back to calling it the castle that nobody was allowed to leave. And underneath it all, under the noise of modernity, under the hum of cities and the chatter of satellites, the heartbeat continued. Slow, patient, eternal. Not the same as before. Softer now. Gentler. As if it no longer wanted to stop the world, only to remind it to rest sometimes. If you visit St. Morel today, you'll find nothing but a plaque. Here once stood the castle that nobody was allowed to leave. Its gates are gone, but its silence endures. The plaque hums faintly when the wind touches it. No one knows why. Some say it's the metal contracting in the cold. Others that it's just imagination. But a few, mostly children, mostly dreamers, swear they can hear a woman's voice in it, quiet and patient, whispering through the years, "Keep moving," and somewhere, beneath the hill, the world still listens. It was early autumn again, the kind of day that smelled faintly of rain and rust. The year was 2025, and the world had long since stopped believing in ghosts. It believed in data now, and in the comfort of explanations that fit inside screens. Still, some places didn't change. The hill outside St. Morel was one of them. It was smaller than people remembered, though it had never truly been large. The grass was still pale gold, and the air still held that strange softness, the quiet weight of something listening. The government fence had rusted through in places, and nature had begun reclaiming what humans tried to contain. The sign still stood. Here once stood the castle that nobody was allowed to leave. The words were almost unreadable now, the metal warped and humming faintly, as though something beneath it still exhaled every few minutes. And that was where Amélie Laurent stopped walking. She wasn't a historian or a mystic. She wasn't even particularly curious. She was a documentarian, traveling across rural France recording soundscapes for an experimental project, Echoes of Forgotten Places, as her producer called it. It was meant to be peaceful, background noise for sleepless minds. Her recorder was simple, digital, precise, unsentimental. It didn't believe in myths. It just measured sound. But as she stood at the edge of the hill, something changed. The hum in the air interfered with the signal. Static crawled through her headphones, rhythmic, pulsing. She tapped the mic. The pulse didn't stop. She frowned. Feedback, she muttered, or ground vibration. Still, she knelt and placed the recorder directly on the grass. The static deepened. Beneath it, something slower, lower, a sound that wasn't quite a sound. Her brow furrowed. She adjusted the gain. The waveform on her screen began to move, not randomly, but in perfect, steady intervals. Tick, tick, tick. She smiled faintly, cute, like a metronome. Then she realized her watch had stopped. It was a subtle thing. One hand frozen, the other trembling just slightly, as if trying to move but afraid to. She exhaled, slow and shaky. The hum in her ears deepened. It wasn't unpleasant. It felt like the world breathing beside her. And then she heard it. A voice. Not through the headphones. Not through the air. Inside. Soft, measured, patient. Keep moving. Amélie froze. The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't frightening. It was warm, almost kind. She looked around. The hill was empty. No wind. No birds. Hello? She whispered. Silence. Then, faintly, that same rhythm pulsed again, like an echo answering a heartbeat. She sat very still for a long time, the recorder still running. When she finally gathered her courage, she spoke into the mic. Who are you? The static shifted. Patterns flickered across the screen. Peaks and valleys, too deliberate to be random. Then, through the hum, I am the pause between your hours. Her throat tightened. Clara? The hum didn't answer directly, but it changed tone, as though acknowledging something. You kept them moving, Amélie said softly. Didn't you? The air shimmered faintly. The hum deepened for a heartbeat, then faded again. She stood slowly. The sun had lowered behind the hills, turning the grass bronze. Her watch began ticking again, quietly, as if nothing had happened. She packed up her equipment and walked back toward the road. That night, in her hotel room, she played back the recording. Most of it was empty static, white noise, like the breath of wind. But near the end, just before she'd stopped the recorder, there was a faint whisper, clear and steady. Time doesn't die. It learns. The waveform pulsed once, like a heartbeat. Then silence. Amélie stared at the screen for a long time. She thought of deleting it, of keeping her project clean, scientific. But she didn't. Instead, she added the track to her collection under a new name, Clara's Hill, The Sound of Stillness. It became the final piece in her series. Millions of people listened to it, not knowing what it was, just that it helped them sleep. The comments beneath the upload all said the same thing. It feels alive. It sounds like breathing. When I listen, I stop thinking. And every night, as the world wound itself down, millions of speakers whispered that same quiet rhythm into bedrooms and hospital halls and sleepless cities. The stillness spread again. Softly this time, kindly. No cages, no locks, just rest. Clara had finally learned how to stop without trapping anyone. She had become the world's lullaby. And somewhere beneath Saint Morel, the earth pulsed once more. Faint, content, infinite. A heartbeat beneath time. So, that's where we'll leave it tonight. The story of a castle that no one could leave, a woman who wouldn't stop moving, and a world that forgot how to rest until she taught it how again. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've outlasted time itself, or at least this particular version of it. And maybe that's the point, isn't it? Every clock eventually stops. Every empire, every heartbeat, every conversation. But something always stays behind. A rhythm, a whisper, a trace of the person who refused to let the world fall completely silent. Maybe you've heard that rhythm too, in the soft hum of your room right now, in the tick of a clock you haven't looked at in hours, in your own heartbeat, steady and patient, reminding you that stillness isn't death. It's the pause that makes everything else make sense. So close your eyes. Let the noise fade. Let the world breathe on its own for a while. Clara would tell you the same thing I will. Keep moving, but don't forget to rest. Good night, friends. And if you ever find yourself in Saint Morel, maybe listen closely. You might still hear her walking. Fade to silence. Faint heartbeat. One last tick. Then nothing.